I'm Tom Maltice. I'm the director of Geneva. Glad that you have joined us in a busy time of the year and busy scheduling, and we're glad you took some time for us as well, to join us as well. This is the 41st year of the Geneva Lectures, and a long history and tradition of excellent speakers, and we look forward to Dr. Song tonight as well. The goal of the Geneva Lecture Series is to bring Christian voices to engage current issues in education or in society and culture. And it's part of Geneva. We set ourselves up as a Christian exploration at UI. And by that we mean that we're helping people explore Christianity, and we're helping Christians also explore their world and their culture, and to look at what the Christian life and Christianity means for life and for learning. I want to say a little bit about Dr. Song. I see, as you saw in maybe the flyer in her bio, she's associate professor and chair of the Sociology and Anthropology Department at Westmont College in Santa Barbara, California. A beautiful campus, but a very expensive place to live, but an absolutely gorgeous area. She received her BA in history from Yale, an MA in Communication Studies from Northwestern University, and a PhD in Sociology from the University of Virginia. Her research has focused on what she is sharing this evening, on how the digital landscape is affecting our culture in many different ways, and especially in the area of one area I heard her speak on last summer. I had not met her until last summer at a conference of the Consortium of Christian Study Centers, which is a group of about 25 Christian campuses across the country that we have just become members of, that are trying to explore how can we be a Christian academic witness on campuses. She came and spoke to the group, and I have to admit, when I first heard her topic, that she was going to talk about mommy blogging, I went, I'm a dutiful person, so I will go. But I was not terribly excited about it. She changed my mind. And the power and breadth of her presentation helped me understand an element of society and culture that I didn't have much knowledge of, but also how it does connect in many other ways. And I look forward to ways that she'll be doing that this evening as well for us. In her book, Virtual Communities, Bowling Alone, Online Together, from 2009, in the preface of her book, she uses a quotation from the opening stanzas of T.S. Eliot's 1934 poem called Choruses from the Rock. In 1934, T.S. Eliot was trying to wrestle with how technology was changing his culture and his world. And the questions are still there. The technology may be different, but the questions are still very relevant. So I'm going to just read a few lines from the opening stanza of T.S. Eliot's poem as kind of our preface for our talk tonight, as Dr. Song used it as a preface for her book. The endless cycle of ideas and action, endless innovation, endless experiment, brings knowledge of motion, but not of silence. Knowledge of motion, but not of stillness. Knowledge of speech, but not of silence. Knowledge of words, but ignorance of the word. All our knowledge brings us nearer to death, but nearness to death no nearer to God. Where is the life we have lost in living? Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we have lost in information? And so we welcome Dr. Song this evening to help us reflect on those questions and more. Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks so much for coming out. It's really an honor to be invited to speak to you, and I want to thank Tom and the Geneva Campus Ministry for this opportunity to share these reflections and ideas about digital technology with you. So during our brief time together, I hope to do three things. First, I'd like to offer a brief sociological diagnosis of our digitally saturated lives. Then second, try to persuade you that our contemporary dilemmas about living with technology are not going to be solved with merely critique and lament, but rather through reviving ancient discourses of character formation. And then third, suggest that such formation is only generative and sustainable when rooted in a high view of human embodiment and when practiced together in community. So my main hope in doing these three things is that this talk will jumpstart conversations and discussions among you all about technology within our homes, within our workplaces, in our classrooms and communities. So to begin, being a good Anglican, I feel compelled to start with a confession, because that's what Anglicans do. A confession that only makes sense within the context of my Baptist roots, so I get the whole range there, which might be called a very brief testimony of sorts, because that's what Baptists do well. So my testimony is this when it comes to technology. I am a late adopter. It wasn't until 2010 that I converted and invited the iPhone 4, if any of you remember that one. The iPhone 4, which was, for Apple fans, was affectionately dubbed the Jesus phone, for obvious reasons. I invited the iPhone 4 into my life. And the reason why I did was because my husband and I, he's an academic as well, felt that perhaps the Jesus phone could help us manage our work lives better as we were traveling and such, and the care of our family. So that was 2010, and then in 2012, I, along with millions of other Americans, began a sincere but half-hearted effort at blogging. And then it wasn't until 2013 that after a relatively long stint of conscientious objection, I finally decided to give over my life data to Mark Zuckerberg and joined Facebook. So through these years, I've been grateful for how my devices have really helped me fashion a life that is more convenient, seemingly more efficient, and even pleasurable. But just as the Christian faith asserts that Jesus transforms anyone who opens themselves to his presence, I can personally testify to the curious ways in which the Jesus phone has also transformed me. My relationships, my work patterns, my routines, even how I think and my heart's preoccupations. And the more I think about how deeply this logic of my technologies have penetrated my daily routines and my subconscious, the more irritated I have become. And so here is my confession. I have been having a very grumpy year and a half now of all things digital. My iPhone, my laptop, my email inbox, my texting, my internet browsing. I am locked in mortal combat every time I engage these devices, because the pleasure I used to enjoy, the sense of satisfaction I used to derive, have been replaced with a sort of cognitive dissonance. And so I've been thinking about this. Why? Why is this happening to me? And so there are three reasons that might be particular to my own life that I've been pondering are contributing to this standoff that I have with my digital technologies. So the first reason might be connected to the fact that as an associate professor and department chair, I spend a lot of time on email. And email seems to demand a fair bit of attention, and it chronically snowballs into inefficiencies and distractions. I know none of you understand that, of course, because you're all very efficient and not distracted by your email. Second, I am knee-deep in the midlife experience and find myself having very conventionally midlife thoughts. What is my life amounting to? What do I want to spend the rest of my life doing with my time? And maybe the way I'm engaging my devices has something to do with that. But maybe it's the third reason, really, that is most tied to this sort of techno-existentialist crisis I'm in, and might have to do with the fact that I have a junior hire who is begging me every day for her own phone. Okay, so these may be very personal reasons why I'm in this standoff with my technology, but as a sociologist, we teach this perennial lesson in our intro classes, and it's from a sociologist named C. Wright Mills, and he said that our personal troubles are often public issues. Okay, our personal troubles are often public issues. And I think this gets at the ways in which we may experience very individualized reasons why we have particular dynamics with our technologies, particular emotions about it. But those very individual reasons are often tied to some larger, broader cultural landscape, some issue that is occurring around us that we are simply a part of. And so when I watch the TED Talks, I listen to the Silicon Valley gurus, I read the big name bloggers and the technologists, I sense a shift in the wind that maybe some of you have picked up on as well. There are several high-profile, high-tech CEOs that speak openly about instituting time limits and banning devices at their family dinner tables. Arianna Huffington, you may be familiar with some of the books that she's written, The Sleep Revolution and Thrive. After experiencing her own physical collapse from exhaustion, she wrote these 2 books to try to call on her readers and fans to live lives that are not driven by technology, not driven by careers, but driven to a life of wisdom and compassion. And finally, public intellectual Andrew Sullivan stopped blogging altogether, saying to his readers, quote, "I want to return to the actual world again. I want to read again, slowly, carefully." You could use one of these, right? And I want to absorb a difficult book and walk around in my own thoughts with it for a while. I want to spend some time with my parents while I still have them and rekindle the friendships that I have simply let wither. And so while public figures like Andrew Sullivan, who have built a large part of their reputations through social media, are unplugging, more and more people like us are paying hundreds of dollars to attend weekend camps called digital detox. So as a culture, it seems that we are apparently coming to some slow realization that maybe our social media and digital technologies have made us very tired. College students admit to being addicted and fatigued by FOMO, fear of missing out, but have no capacity to imagine how they could live without their devices. When we have left our offices and go on vacation, many of us feel like our jobs follow us there as tacit expectations to respond to emails and off-hour requests keep us tethered to our work. Even when we try to rest, we are restless, and we reach for our phones and our tablets because our bodies and our imaginations have forgotten what else to reach for. So whatever honeymoon we might have experienced with the thrills of being connected and alive, with the quick and witty exchanges of words and images in social media, many of us are experiencing a bit of a technological disenchantment. So what is happening to us here? So here's the sociological bit. So back in the 90s, we can move back there for a little bit, when the notion of the internet was first introduced, this idea of forming and carrying on relationships through the glow of a computer screen was met with either lamentation or euphoria. Right? You had some people who feared that we would just start neglecting our real lives and be seduced by this virtual reality thing, right? But there were more people who were really dazzled by this prospect of the internet connecting us to people around the world and creating these new avenues of support and community. 20 years down the line, we've been engaged in this magnificent experiment of digital communication, and it seems like the optimists were right. We don't appear to have become a society of isolated persons, cloistered in our bedrooms or the basements, forgetting our families and our jobs. In fact, many scholars point to the fact that we are more connected than ever. And yet, we would be naive if we did not recognize how dramatically we have gone from simply going online in the 90s to living in 2017 in a digitally saturated society, right? So what going online or being on the internet meant in the 90s was very, very different from where we are now. So what does it look like now? What are some of the characteristics? Scholars are talking about how now we live in a state of permanent connectivity, right? Even if our devices are not on or in our hands, our minds and our consciousness are thoroughly immersed in the habits of mind formed by our digital practices. So I'd like to highlight 4 features of this permanent connectivity, okay? So one of them is that our technology is image-oriented, okay? From games to videos to profiles to pictures, our digital experience, a lot of it immerses and engages our imagination in images. And these images have a way of forming our imaginations rather than asking our imaginations to flex their own muscles, because so much of the content we consume is image-based and therefore passively consumed. And it is other people's designs, other people's decisions about how to tell stories, how to portray realities that are shaping what we take in. A second feature is that our technology is social. And so it's where our friends and our loved ones are. And we have become people who feel compelled and desire to wade through these foaming currents of blog posts and friends lists and status updates and photos and comments, while simultaneously supplying our own bursting streams of content to our loved ones. And while being digitally tethered to each other can create a sense of security and thriving, it can also become a crutch when we are incapable of being alone with ourselves. And the tethering can also become a type of soft tyranny of social expectations when we are expected to always be available and immediately responsive to any text or email. And so, in the socialness of our technologies today, these pleasures and expectations combine to feed a kind of compulsion to check our emails, to peek at our social media feeds, to text or tweet one more time. The third feature concerns the fact that our technology is mobile, and this is huge, right? While most of us may remember the internet of yesteryear, right? Back in the 90s, where was our internet? It was on a desktop computer, and it was dialed into the wall, right? It was dialed into the wall at work, at home, in your schools, and now it is in our pockets. It is on our wrists, right? It's in our bags. Our social media and digital technology is far more imminent, and so our digital lives with us. It moves along with us, and it creates a 24/7 dynamic that didn't exist before. Connected to that is the fourth characteristic, that our technology is infinitely distracting. We turn to our devices constantly because our social media feeds are ceaselessly ready to be refreshed, right? The little pull down, right? Refresh, refresh. Our games, if any of us enjoy our games, are always updating, little features, right, to explore. There are always new texts, there's always new emails to check. So this promise of fulfillment, of completion, of emotional connection is always just a few inches from our reach. And so we're constantly just wondering, okay, just a little bit more, maybe I can get it done, maybe I can get this part done. So with our digital experiences characterized in these four ways, images, the social, mobility, and infinite distraction, it is not surprising that our collective consciousness is increasingly one in which we feel that we are always needing to catch up, right? Catch up on our emails, catch up on our texts, catch up on our feeds. And Dalton Conley describes this life as being constantly lived elsewhere, right? Our bodies are in one place, but our minds and our consciousness are residing focused on the stuff of our screens. And so we swipe on the glass with a kind of anticipation, right? And we gaze into the glass, and that gaze is very similar to the gaze you sometimes see in casino floors when gamblers are pulling the lever of the slot machines one more time. So that's a provocative parallel, right? And to draw the parallel between our contemporary digital practices and gambling habits is not too far of a stretch when you consider the physiological effects of technology with our habits here. So some of you are probably familiar with growing evidence that every time our phones give us a notification, a little ping, right, there's that dopamine release that's activated in our brains, along with the other opiates and neurochemicals that charge up that reward center, right, that pleasure pathway. And studies show that these are the same changes in the neurotransmitters that have been found in years of research in drug, alcohol, and gambling addictions, right? It's basically the same mechanism, right, on the most essential fundamental level. And the implications of these studies are particularly grave when considering the effects of technology on young people's yet developing brains. And there are questions arising now about the connections between digital practices of our young people and increased trends in anxiety and depression. Other studies also suggest that even the sheer anticipation of email and other digital stimulation is taking up working memory in our brains. And so there's all these studies that are looking into the possibilities that our brains may, while there's a plasticity and a resilience to our brains, right? They can rewire, but there are ways in which perhaps they are also being overtaxed and overstimulated by our practices. And whatever the outcome may be years down the line, the truth is we actually know very little about what is going to happen to our brains, or what is happening to our brains as we engage in these practices on this permanent connectivity level. So interestingly, while one might argue that we are losing control over our compulsions to engage our digital devices, these devices also give us the ability to control others, that is, to dial down other people's access to us. So MIT psychologist Sherry Turkle writes about this in her work, where she argues that more and more of us prefer technological mediation over and above face-to-face or voice-based interactions. So put simply, we prefer to text than to call. We prefer to email than to stop by face-to-face. Why? Because the face-to-face encounter, which is so rich in its nonverbal cues, now increasingly feels psychically overwhelming to many of us that have gotten used to the digital way. Right? Face-to-face means the risk of the silences that are awkward, the uncertainty, the fumbling for the right words. And instead of working to better meet these less appealing aspects of our very human encounters, we prefer to hide. We flatten out and edit away our discomfort with a few well-chosen acronyms, some emojis here, and let's move on, right? So we increasingly find the temptation, right, of using our devices to grant us distance from each other, because it takes a lot of work to actually engage each other on a face-to-face level. And it gives us permission to downshift to our lesser selves. Right? It's far easier to let each other publicly signal absence and unavailability with our tech use than risk encountering each other as real persons. And so for some of us, we may not even realize our compulsions. We may not even realize how our use of technology may be negatively impacting the people around us. But in studies that ask children what they wish for most when it comes to technology in our households, the number one thing that kids wish occurred in their households is that their parents would get off their phones more. So one quote from a child said, I think about my dad. I wish my dad would put his mobile phone away and just enjoy watching me play soccer once in a while. So there's quotes like this that suggest to me, yeah, we have arrived at a cultural moment. More and more we're willing to recognize something may not be quite right. And so it's at this moment that I think we can either ignore the signs and risk further impoverishment of our lives, or we can decide to consider moving towards a more thoughtful technological practice. For those who identify with the Christian faith in particular, I believe there are ready theological resources to guide this process of becoming reacquainted with what it means to be a human, to be a person in its fullness. So where can we begin there? I think it's helpful to first establish a theological anthropology, which is to say what it means to be human in relation to the divine. So here I'm drawing from a recent work by Jamie Smith, a philosopher at Calvin College, who critiques the dominant view that we have in society, that is a rationalist anthropology, right? It's a view of human beings that privileges the mind and argues that our human personhood is primarily runs through our identities as thinkers, what we believe in our minds, processors of propositions and beliefs. And Smith argues that we ought to move away from this and actually return a little bit more to the Augustinian view of human beings who are lovers, not thinkers, primarily. And what we do daily with our bodies, the stuff that churns in our guts, is ultimately what motivates the outcomes of our lives. So he writes, to quote Smith, "The way our desires get aimed in specific directions is through practices that shape, mold, and direct our love. Routines that inscribe particular ongoing habits into our character such that they become secondary nature to us. Some of the habits that we are regularly immersed in are actually thick, formative practices that over time embed in us desires for a particular version of the good life." So Smith proposes a theological anthropology that anchors our primary orientation to the world as being visceral, as bodily, rather than cerebral. And in doing that, creates a new way of imagining what we're actually doing when our lives are enmeshed in the digital. For in privileging the bodily practices, Smith is arguing that when left to our own devices, yes, there's a pun there, we inevitably find ourselves engaged in practices that he calls secular liturgies. Okay, secular liturgies are rituals and habits that he argues misform our desires, our heart's desires. And he writes, "Secular liturgies capture our hearts by capturing our imaginations and draw us into ritual practices that teach us to love something very different from the kingdom of God." So in her book, Alone Together, Turkle writes of a vignette where a friend is wondering out loud to her about the meaning of a particular daily ritual she engages in. Right? And this daily ritual involves waking up and going to sleep by checking her phone for email and her social media while still in bed. I know none of us do that either. So in light of Smith's notion of secular liturgies, this somewhat mundane ritual starts to read differently, or read rather poignantly, if we see how checking our phones has replaced the disciplines of reading scriptures and prayer that religious adherents have historically engaged during the early morning and the late evening. So the question is, if we think of these practices through the lens of secular liturgies, what soul formation or what soul misformation is taking place when I go to sleep and arise with my emails and social media feeds, bookending my bodily rest? And Smith calls on Christians then to engage in what he calls counter liturgies, which push back against these misformations of the heart. So in response to whatever our secular liturgy may be, right? For some of us, we may turn to our phones whenever we are bored. For me, after a long day, all I want to do is have my 30 minutes with my Candy Crush, right? Whatever that secular liturgy is, we are faced with the question, what are our counter liturgies to try to push back against that liturgy that may be misforming my soul in a particular way? So some examples of counter liturgies might be this. So for some of us, we might really enjoy multitasking. And apart from the fact that there are lots of studies that show multitasking is very ineffective, right? There might be some sort of secular liturgy there, right? A type of misformation. And so a counter liturgy might involve experiments in mono or unitasking, right? So when you're eating alone or if you're driving, right? What if I just turned everything off, right? No music, no podcasts. I'm not reading things while I'm eating on my phone. What if I just did that? What would happen, right? Would I become more aware of my own thoughts? Would I become more aware of the place that I'm in, the people around me? Would I become more aware of God's presence in that moment, right? And the silence might feel awkward at first, but maybe there's something valuable to discover in that counter-liturgical moment that we often just push aside when we are multitasking. Another example, what if instead of simply turning to my phone during a break in class or after a meeting, I made a point to myself, I'm going to turn to my classmate, I'm going to turn to my colleague and ask how their day was doing. Something very basic, but actually might be very intimidating and difficult, because surely the person next to you may be looking at their phone, right? But again, perhaps a counter liturgy that might start to push back against these patterns that are forming in our hearts. So what I particularly like about Smith's use of the terms secular liturgy and counter liturgy is its reliance on the word liturgy, which in Greek means work of the people. So this is a definition that really warms my heart as a sociologist, because it brings out the ways in which certain practices are not individual in nature, but are actually the product of the people, right? That many people, a community, a culture. And these practices retain their power and remain sustainable precisely because they are practiced as a group or a culture. So if secular liturgies are practices that possess power, think social media, right? Facebook, Instagram, they possess power. Why? Because there are groups of people on that platform that you want to be with, right? They possess their power because we engage in them together. If that is the case, then Christians need to find a way to engage in bodily counter-liturgies together. One of my main assertions is that while personal acts of technological self-discipline and restraint may be essential to our lives, it's ultimately going to be a communal effort in counter-liturgies that prove effective and sustainable. Year after year, when I teach classes on the internet, college students have told me that they're tired of Instagram, they're tired of Snapchat, but there's no way they would ever get off of it because the social costs are just way too high. And I totally get that, right? But I suggest to them, well, okay, let's think about this for a second. Let's try to push back, right? What if we did an experiment, right? What if you and the closest friends, the ones you really want to keep in touch with, get together and you all say, yeah, there's got to be a better way. And you just decide amongst your close friends, let's take a break. Let's take a break for a week. 1 week. We're going to get off of Instagram. We're going to get off of Snapchat. Just 1 week, we're going to try something else to figure out how to talk to each other and stay in each other's lives. A sort of social media exodus of sorts, right? And see what happens, right? And again, it is that collective nature, the group nature, that makes it possible to consider this option. So the point is, our tech practices do not need to be privatized. We live in a society that individualizes us as autonomous persons, as individual families, but I don't think those individual, that unit has to be the sole arbiter of how technology gets used. When set within this framework of counter-liturgy, the work of the people, it's wholly possible to begin imagining groups of friends, families, church communities, work organizations, promising each other to commit collectively to not subjecting each other to the fears of missing out, but choosing to abide by some type of countercultural practice. So some small experiments that we might try might be email-free Fridays at work. Ooh, I know. Hard to imagine at first, but maybe for some of us it might be possible, depending on what kind of work you're engaged in. Tech-free workplaces or rooms in the house. Tech-free vacations together. Agreements, again, between friends to make phone calls instead of texting, and that a phone call does not mean an emergency, that something horrible has happened. It's just, I want to talk and chat. Even goofy games like phone stack at social gatherings that compel friends to, you put all the phones in the middle of the table when you go out to eat, right? And whoever reaches for their phone first has to face the punishment of paying the bill, right? It's silly stuff. We can be creative, right? About thinking about trying out counter practices so that we can stop thinking about how necessarily to limit our technologies, but get more serious about trying out our humanity, right? What would it be like if we actually heard each other's voices, spoke to each other face to face? Would something change? So in this, I believe the Christian faith possesses a very good news to those of us who may be exhausted by our digitally saturated lives. And it's in Christianity that there is a heritage and a theology that reminds us that our embodiment matters. I think part of the trouble with our growing dependence on our digital practices is that we begin to accept the modernist disregard for the fact that we are indeed embodied persons who bring physical presence and voice to each other, right? And that other people's voices and presence impinge upon us as well. And there is certainly throughout the scriptures evidence of this high view of our embodiment. Right, the creation story, deeming physical creation and human beings good, the incarnation of Jesus, living and walking among us, experiencing the fullness of our human frailty and our image of godness, his ministry of bodily healings and subsequent bodily death and resurrection. My favorite moment in the Gospels is when the voice of the resurrected Messiah that utters Mary's name suddenly dissolves her blindness and she can see clearly and recognize the person that is so familiar and close to her, right? It is the voice, not even seeing him, right? That kind of makes it clear for her. And finally, the doctrine of the resurrected body to be raised up when Jesus returns as king, right? Just throughout scriptures, there's tons of evidence of the body being significant and valued in our humanness. Some of you may be familiar with C.S. Lewis's words when he famously preached on the value of human presence. He wrote, "It is a serious thing to live in a society of possible gods and goddesses, to remember that the dullest and most uninteresting person you may talk to may one day be a creature which, if you saw it now, you would be strongly tempted to worship, or else a horror and a corruption such as you now meet, if at all, only in a nightmare. There are no ordinary people. You have never talked to a mere mortal. Next to the Blessed Sacrament itself, your neighbor is the holiest object presented to your senses, physical senses." So if in our daily haste, we use our technology as an excuse to escape encountering the intrinsic glory built into each other's commanding presence, perhaps our hearts should be chastened to remember who we are actually interacting with. Perhaps we would think twice before hiding behind our technologies to avoid that dull and uninteresting person, or put on our headphones to excuse ourselves from recognizing the image of godness in that neighbor sitting next to us. And so just as being human may mean better understanding how we are inextricably tied to our bodies and the bodies of our neighbors, it may be equally human for us to grasp how our bodies are tied to the things that are material in this world. I think when you look at many religious traditions, there's an understanding that the material spaces, the places in which we occupy, are also holy, instilled with a sacredness and mystery even, if only we had eyes to see. So here I think American Christians might benefit from taking some cues from our Jewish cousins with their traditions that seem to better understand and practice the honoring of this sacred materiality and objects and spaces. I apologize, I keep on hitting this thing. So in Judaism, right, if the bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah service includes a beautiful and holy ritual that involves a young man or woman engaged in the presentation of the Torah for the first time, right, lifting the sacred text out of the ark and physically walking it among the people, signaling, right, for the first time, right, the maturation of this child to a man or a woman. When I attended my first bar mitzvah, it was my nephew's, I was not only incredibly moved by this moment in the service, right, when he was walking the Torah amongst the people, I was equally struck by a little sentence that was written on the bottom of the program that asked everyone to turn off and put away their electronic devices. And it explained, it said, the synagogue is a holy place of worship, deserving of reverence and respect. That's all, it just said that. And so there's this little tidbit in the synagogue etiquette had quietly but confidently drawn a counter-liturgical line. It said, this is a sacred space, right? Let's just, for the moment, put these technologies away, okay? Even in non-religious institutions, there are many that are beginning to ask similar questions about our devices and our spaces. Art museums. Art museums are really interesting because they are, on the one hand, trying to create this sacred space to celebrate art and allow people to commune with art. And yet they are also seeking to remain relevant to modern audiences with guided tours and apps that tell you about the context and the artists. But many art museum directors are discovering that museum visitors go through museums like this. They're reading, and they look up, but then they're reading and looking at the image, and then just checking that the image is the same one they have on their phones, and then they just move on. And this is a very interesting dilemma. There was an interview with Connie Wolf, who's the director of Stanford's Cantor Art Center, where she remarked on this inherent tension. She said, in our busy lives, we're always connected to technology. People want to come into museums and put that technology aside for a moment. And so at her museum, what they do to try to create a counter-liturgy is they offer their visitors a very old technology. They give every visitor a package of colored pencils and sketching paper. And in doing so, there's a kind of hopefulness that's signaled, right, very gently to the visitor to stop and gaze and engage in the sacred act of creation themselves as they are walking around this space. And so the question I'd like to ask tonight is, do we dare to believe the same things about our sacred spaces? In our churches, at our dinner tables, in our bedrooms, in our classrooms, in our relationships with each other. Just as Connie Wolf said, do we really believe people want to come and put that technology aside for a moment to experience a sacred space? So in conclusion, I want to turn to the topic of food. Okay, I really enjoy food, and so any chance I get to talk about food, I try. So a couple years ago, I read Michael Pollan's book, In Defense of Food, An Eater's Manifesto. And it starts with 7 words. Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. So these words function as the backbone of his proposal that we become more thoughtful about what and why we eat. So on the surface, this directive, eat food, sounds a bit odd, because how can you sell books telling people to do something that they already do and is biologically necessary? However, Poland's emphasis is less on the word eat and more on the word food. That is, make sure that when you eat, you are consuming food, not just processed food products like margarine, prepackaged foods like breakfast cereals, Pop-Tarts, my children's favorite, low-fat this, fat-free that, but he argues real food, plants, animals, grains. And in this book, he challenges the modern food industry and shows that too often the admonitions we receive about fiber and fats are not necessarily fully grounded in sound scientific data, but rather often combine in the results of vested interests, like the meat and corn industries. So he pushes back against this 20th century industrialization of food and calls his readers to stop counting calories and stick to these 7 simple words. Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. And to realize that food is more than nutrition. It is about many other things like family, spirituality, relationship with nature, our cultural identities. So after reading Poland's indictment of contemporary food, I remember looking at my refrigerator and my pantry, open it up, and thinking about my family's routine diet. And I will tell you, I despaired. I've got 2 kids. They love, all the things that are beige and in packages, right? So while I happen to be economically privileged enough to consider committing to only buying from our local farmers, the organic, grass-fed, non-GMO food so readily available in California, I still struggle with whether it's just too much of a luxury to justify instead of putting that same money away in my children's college fund or maybe donating to some type of international pressing cause. So Poland educated me in the problematic nature of our food, and now every decision when I eat is fraught. I wonder, am I doing the right thing? Should I be doing this? But then I learned about the work of a man named Dan Barber. He's the head chef of a restaurant in New York called Blue Hill Farm, and he's a leader in the farm-to-table movement. He too is committed to supporting the local farming industry, but for him it's not about healthy diet or the ethics of our food industry. Rather, his passion is as a chef. And what do chefs care about? They care about taste. And the thing he cares about most is serving food that tastes amazing. So from his perspective, taste comes naturally from untampered ingredients and rediscovering old varieties of vegetables and grains that have gone out of favor simply because they did not suit the large-scale transportation process that our food industry so heavily relies on. So because he sees how much the food supply is distorted by the industrialization of our food, one of his goals as a chef is to cook food that reminds his customers what food can taste like. And so he works with local farmers to raise animals and grow plants that result in the best tasting squash, the best tasting cheese, the best tasting bread, offering tastes that his diners might never have experienced before, vegetables that taste more like themselves, not bland, not flavorless, but rich, freshly picked varieties with flavor profiles that might knock all of our socks off. And so Dan Barber is someone who is all about reigniting our imaginations about food and how it can taste. And in that way, he's been an inspiration for me. So how Poland and Barber think and feel about food is how I have come to think and feel about technology and what I would call the industrialization of our human encounters. So in 2017, we exist in this technological landscape that, like food, is a result of decades of decisions that have been made, systems created to frame how we talk to each other, communicate our desires and wishes, experience leisure and rest. Much like the warehouse supermarkets, such as Costco or Sam's Club, our digital systems of communication, information, and entertainment are incredibly efficient. They provide us with amazing resources and choices and are very cost-effective in so many ways. But in the same way that we may never have tasted what a squash or a green bean could really be like, or what it actually is, we are at the point in which we may forget, and we may have lost a taste for, a communication that involves human presence and voice, and we forget the genuine goods that are born out of such a landscape. So much as viewing food as merely a vehicle for nutrition destroys the generative aspects of eating, so too does viewing communication as merely a way to transmit our thoughts and intentions from one place to another. Just as we have been sold food-like substances purporting to be better than the vegetation and grains of old, we have been sold communication-like moments through texting, email, and social media purporting to be superior to the face-to-face embodied interactions of old. And in the same way that Pauline's mission is to educate and Barbara's mission is to revive our appetites for taste in food, I'd like to suggest that there is much educating and inspiring needed in our present age. We need to find ways to imagine more deeply how we can build a collective life in this digital age that doesn't impoverish our humanity, that somehow can recharge us and help us actually experience what it is to know and be known, so that one day we can turn to those around us and say, "Come, taste and see that the Lord is good." Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Song, for addressing issues we all wrestle with. And I'm sure there are going to be many other comments or questions, and you'll have opportunity to do that in a moment as you kind of formulate that, and I'll pass the mic around that you can ask a comment or ask further enlightenment in a certain area. I just, as you were talking, was thinking of a story that a fellow campus pastor told me last week. She said that a bicyclist had run into her car last week. And she said she could see it happening because he was riding his bike down the street with earbuds in his ears and on his phone at the same time. And she just watched him come right towards her and didn't move at all. He ran into her vehicle, fell off his bike, rolled across the hood, and the first thing he did was check to make sure his phone was still working. And he said to her, "It's okay, it works." Didn't care about his body in any way, but his phone still worked. I think it gives good expression to some of the extremes that we're wrestling with. Yes. Someone that would like to initiate a question or comment?
I was just curious whether you have any insight on how kind of all these issues have changed how we learn and how we retain information.
So I'm mainly going to draw from Sherry Turkle here because she writes on this. She talks about how the young people that she researches increasingly have difficulty engaging in deep reading. So when they're given a text that is dense in nature or requires a fair bit of sustained attention, most of her students or these young people have a more skimming or grazing type of reading because it's how we read our social media. And I think there are studies that show this, right? That our brains have a kind of plasticity, right? And the argument is young people, as increasingly they are using these digital media, their brains may be getting wired in particular ways that only work on this sort of skimming, grazing level, so that the deep reading is actually physiologically, right, becoming more difficult. It's not just that they're lazy, right? It's not that. It's like it's actually becoming more difficult. And so I think the question is how institutions of education decide to respond to that, right? And I think that's where you get these debates between some people who believe that, well, the young people have moved, so we need to move with them. And so we need to develop curriculum that accommodates this change, and that this change may be in some ways productive and useful in particular ways, and we need to explore that. And then you have people on the other side who are trying to push back against that and say, no, whoa, we need to figure out how to inculcate much more kind of slower pace, deeper reading. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Someone else?
So let me just play devil's advocate. I just wonder if through the history of humanity, new technology has always led to people who look back and say, oh, if we only sang our histories instead of writing them down.
Yeah.
Oh, if we only wrote instead of
Yes.
typed. Oh, if we only read instead of watched.
Yeah.
And do you think this is something distinctively different? Are you just being a curmudgeon at this point? Or is there something uniquely different about what the way technology is impacting us? And in particular, I'm thinking myself versus my grandchildren, for instance. I feel like a very analog kind of guy in a digital world, and I enjoy the digital.
Yeah.
But I feel like my grandkids are immersed in it,
Yeah.
and they will be qualitatively different as they grow up. And I'm just wondering how you see what we're experiencing now as different or
Right.
as a theme with all the changes that have come before.
Yes, great question. I tend towards the curmudgeonly. I really try to work against that. But yes, I'm probably dispositionally bent that way. With that said, yes, every technology that has come about, the printing press, the radio, the telegraph, right, all those things, people, there were voices that railed against it and worried. I think I want to say that, so in that sense, things are not different, and that we're just dealing with the particular changes that are in our lifetime. However, I guess I want to say, rather than, I think most people that make that argument just say, well, then I don't need to think about it. I'm just going to follow the way of progress and just move along, because look at our human civilization, right? Like, it's so much better than what it was before, so let's not look back. And I want to say, well, that's really naive, okay? Because I think what we can do is, at the very least, do a kind of audit or accounting of what is being gained and what is being lost in each of these shifts, right? So when we went from pre-printing press to post-printing press, right, there were all these wonderful possibilities that emerged, but then perhaps there were some things that were lost. And so let's at least try to be transparent and recognize the things that we are losing and say, hey, let's evaluate this thing that I'm losing. Is this something I'm fine with losing? Is something going to be diminished in our life together if I lose this? Let's at least observe and have a discussion rather than just moving forward and just saying, oh, whatever's gone is gone, not a problem, right? I think it's the needing to account for both the possibilities and the losses that, as a society, I think, American culture, we don't have much of a stomach for. We like to kind of just move on. Thinking generationally, I think then that leads to the question of, some of us may remember more what it is to live in an analog way, and then the generations that are younger than us may never know what that is, a particular type of analog experience. And so again, when it comes to those things that are perhaps the losses, the question is, again, for those of us that may be straddling both worlds, we can evaluate and maybe make decisions like, I don't want to lose that analog thing, right? But then for my children or my children's children, they may not even have a choice. Is that okay? Like how do I keep that thing that is good and bring that into their life, right? How do I don't want them to lose that aspect, right? And so that's why I kind of like the food analogy, because it has the same quality of like, I don't know what a really good tomato may taste like. I don't know what the vegetables that my ancestors ate. Maybe it was a lot better than whatever I get at the local supermarket. And that's a loss to me, and I have no idea, right? And so, so I want to suggest, hey, let's just have the conversation. And we don't need to be just throw everything out. And I'm not suggesting that. I think it's more, how do we, if we recognize that there are losses in the thing that is going away, how do we hold on to that with the digital, right? And how do we bring that together instead of just kind of feeling, I think a lot of people feel resigned and feel sort of like, it's just gonna be a loss. I can't do anything about it. The train's left the station, nothing to do. I think people, especially within the church, I think the institution of the church holds a lot of resources for holding on to some of those things, or like bringing it back in a fresh way, and says, hey, we can do this with the technology. It's not this sort of, we got to either hold on to this or hold on to this. We can try to integrate these things.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I tend towards the technology side of things, and I sent my first email 40 years ago. So but one of the things that seems to me to be on the plus side of things is that when my grandmother moved from Europe to the United States at the age of 20, she never saw her mother again. Okay, and when you look at how we are distributed, the proximity question, I think, is there, that our families are distributed. So today, I feel like I saw my mother and both of my daughters and my granddaughter and my grandson, and none of them are in Iowa. And I was able to do that because of technology. I also had a meeting this morning with someone in the UK, someone in South Africa, and when there's unrest in South Africa, it makes a difference to me because I'm working with people who are there. And so, but that distribution of corporations across, the global companies and our families being distributed, the digital brings so much to that. I do see my mother, even if it's on FaceTime. I do see people. So the flip side of that, and I think that whole fact that we're not in close proximity has, how do you deal with that, with doing a digital cleanse? My work and my family are all distributed.
Yes, yeah, so I think the sociological realities of our increased mobility, the fact that we are far-flung from each other, is a reality that's not going away. People aren't gonna suddenly start living in their villages, and like you said, there's transnational corporations. So I think the conversation tends to rest on, I guess I think of it like the technology, the conversation tends to be put in terms of on or off technology, like either it's all on or it's all off. And I wanna say that maybe we also need to add to that conversation, it's not just the technology that's in that picture, but there's also human vulnerabilities and human frailty, okay? So yes, incredible possibilities that for some of us that may be disciplined, and for some of us that may have a good sense of presence and have a good sense of healthy relationships with people, that can all work very well, right? But then there are some people who may have particular human frailties or vulnerabilities where, I have some students who say, and I find this interesting. My children are still young, so I'm wondering how it'll be when they get to college. But some of my students tell me, I talk to my mother every day, which in some ways sounds lovely. But to me, and they say it in a positive way, not in the way like my mom makes me call, they really appreciate that they can talk to their mother every day. But as someone that grew a lot, I grew a lot in college because I left physically my family and I could not see them and I needed to discover what I thought and make decisions on my own. I kind of feel bad for my student, that the tethering is wonderful, but at the same time, if she is to untether herself and say to her mom, Mom, let's just talk once a week, right? That's a hard thing for her to say for a lot of reasons. And so, but I think there's a vulnerability that I would say, for technologists, that I would say, hey, let's design technologies that have a better appreciation of our of our human vulnerabilities, right? Let's not make apps that actually rely on gambling habits, like what people know about how casinos work and how, that's what's being done. Like, let's not do that. Let's create apps that actually try to help people create boundaries and know when to stop and know when to back off, right? I just think there's so much technologies that are exploiting our vulnerabilities, exploiting our loneliness, exploiting our boredom. That's the part that's troubling. So I want to say, hey, let's be aware that they're human beings with our frailties and our vulnerabilities and try to attend to those things.
I was wondering if you could say more about multitasking and whether that really exists. I sat in a conference today, supposedly educational. There were two people in front of me on their laptops doing emails. There were people on either side of me on their cell phones, not taking notes or checking on, looking up something in relation to the conference. And yet I think they thought they were doing at least two things at one time.
Right.
Were they really?
Yeah. Well, everyone thinks they're multitasking. I think the studies just show that we usually do both things poorly. So we are doing both things, but we're not doing them well. And that when we become accustomed to that, our brains forget in some ways how to do the one thing well. It's sort of itching for something else. And so it's multitasking exists, it just isn't as productive as the people that think they're doing it hope. Yeah.
I appreciated the applying Jamie Smith's work to technology. One thing that I thought was interesting, and I wanted to know if you could comment more about this, is that it's very clear to me in the case of food what the telos was for the chef, for instance, to make quality tasting foods. And one of the things that Smith tries to do is to not just say that something forms us, but to what does it form us? What's the telos of the practice? And I didn't hear you say much about what the telos of technology was, and so I wondered if you could talk about that.
Nice.
So.
Yeah, oh, that's good. I need to work on that. You're right. So I guess that would be connected to my previous comment about human vulnerability and frailty, right? So the technology is supposed to work for us. We're not supposed to be working for the technology and the companies that are making money off of us. And so I think when it comes to the telos should be our humanity in our image of Godness, right? That should be what our technology helps us move towards. And I think there are aspects of that that don't have to be strictly Christian, that there are lots of propositions we can make about human dignity and proper acknowledgement of our embodiment that several traditions can draw from.
Well, and since telos means both goal and end, maybe it is an appropriate place to end and say thank you again.
Thanks, everyone.